All right, hey everybody. So I'm gonna keep going into this string project. I think this is video 15. So we've been doing this altogether about 7 hours, 7.5, depending on how you want to count it. And basically, I want to shift gears away from the code for just a second because I'm not really feeling like doing much coding, but I would like to do something. I would like to continue making progress, or feel like I'm making progress. And so this is in times like these where I don't feel like writing code. What I really concentrate on is technical excellence, or improving my experience and my ability to be productive. And so what we're going to be talking about mainly today is coding style and standards, and sort of why they're important. We're going to be discussing more of the similarities and bridge between natural language, so English and Hindi and Japanese and Chinese, and programming languages in general and specific, right? So we've been using PHP and Swift up to this point. But before we do that, I want to sort of make sure that I show you guys this. So I'm going to go ahead and launch Sublime because I've obviously shut everything down. And if you notice, when I launch Sublime, I don't have that same layout that we had, right? Where we had the really nice big screen and then we had the two smaller panes down at the bottom. I don't have any of that going on when I relaunch Sublime. And so I could go into Origami and I could say, let's create a pane below, and then go down below and say I want to create a pane to the right, and everything like that. Right? I could do that every time, but why would you want to do that? Right? So what we can do instead is we can say Command Shift P. We can bring up the Origami commands, and we can say save current layout. Okay. So if we do that, it brings up a pane down here, and I can say, 3 bottom. Now, I've already done that, so I'm not going to do it again. But basically, as soon as I hit enter, it just takes a snapshot of how the panes are laid out, and all of a sudden I have it. Okay. Now, the problem is that I can't open a folder or a file with that layout already in place, right? So if I come over here and drag the string folder onto Sublime, it opens up Sublime Text with a full window, and if I do Command KB, we can see that everything is sort of there. Okay. Now, but again, the problem is that I can't go in here and say View Origami Window with or from saved layout, right? And then hit 3 bottom, right? If I hit Command KB, there's no folder. I'm not in that folder, right? Like, it didn't apply to this window here. It created a new window. So the question becomes, how do we get this folder, or one just like it, into this project panel? Okay. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to actually bring up another Finder window and show you guys something else. So what I've decided to do, because I've sort of run into, now that I've been doing this for 15 videos, I've run into enough problems where I've been in the middle of recording, somebody knocks on the door, or somebody just gate crashes somehow, right? Like some loud sound happens and all of a sudden I got to start over, or to be honest, I might even just get flustered and I'm like, man, I got to start over. Right? And so what I end up doing a lot of times is I'll end up Command Zing my way back to where I was when I started, and then starting the recording over again. And that's not too safe, and there are other ways that I could do this, like with Git and things like that. We can talk about that later. But this seems like a workable solution right now. So what I did is I went ahead and I copied and pasted that folder as this folder. Okay. So where did I start? I started with this version that's on the desktop, right? And moving forward, of course, that's not going to be the case. And then I just copied and pasted or duplicated that folder again. And I created string underscore end. Okay. And that way, if somebody knocks on the door or gate crashes in some other way, when I come back, all I have to do, if I feel like I need to start over, right? Because sometimes I can sort of edit things together in such a way that it seems okay. But if I feel like I need to start over, I can just delete string underscore end, copy paste, and drag the folder back. I'm having a real problem with dragging things today. That obviously is not working. There we go. And so basically what you want to do is you want to drag and drop the folder onto Sublime, and Sublime will just open the directory, right? And so this circumvents origami altogether. So open up Sublime, get origami with the saved layout, drag and drop the folder you want to see. So here we go. Now we've talked a lot before. Oh, and I'm going to do Command Shift plus to make this window bigger. The text in that window bigger. So we've been talking, I've mentioned it a lot, just sort of as asides, right? That programming languages and natural languages have a lot in common, and that the problems and the ways that we overcome those problems are pretty similar. So let's do this actually. So I'm going to bring up the two bottom panes, and I'm going to make that text a little bit bigger and make that text a little bit bigger. All right, so with natural languages, we have, I've mentioned it before, we have syntax and we have semantics. I think that's how you spell semantics. And then with regard to typesetting, okay, with typesetting, you have other considerations, right? And I'm not. We basically have what's called layout, or what I will call layout, if nothing else. So, left is natural language, writing, and then on the other side we have programming language, and this is also writing. All right, and so layout, we'll get to that later. But we also, in programming languages, have syntax and semantics. Right? So if we look at natural language, let's just take an easy sentence that we're all pretty familiar with. Hello world, exclamation mark. Well, hello, comma, world, exclamation mark. So the comma and the exclamation mark are both syntax. Okay? It's non-characters, right? Like non-glyphs, alphabetical glyphs that communicate meaning in some way. Okay? So hello, that's a word made up of some characters. The comma basically acts as a pause, right? Or as an indicator or a cue of what to expect next. Right? So in this context, your brain might go, hello, comma, okay, obviously the next thing is going to be some type of proper noun, right? So it could very well be Bob, it could very well be Josh, it could very well be Nancy, it could very well be Sue, right? But your brain, given the rules, given the semantic rules, understands that, okay, I've started here, this is the type of word, this is usually the intent. When there's a comma, that means that this next word is probably going to be a proper noun, right? And somebody is saying hello to somebody else. And then you get the exclamation mark, and what that does is it lets us know what type of inflection or emotional impact is behind that statement. So generally speaking, we have three types of that in natural language, or at least for English, and each one derives from the same thing, which is the period or full stop. Right? So with a period or a full stop, it's plain, it's bland. Hello world. With the exclamation mark, right, it's a modified period. That's hello world, right? There's a little bit more excitement. There's a little bit more something behind there. The question mark is another modified period to let us know this is a full sentence, and communicate inflection or intent, right? Hello world, right? Like I'm confused why we're doing this. Now, you could have both, right? And I really need to look this up because I cannot remember the name. Exclamation and question mark together. Exclamation point. Wow. Oh, no. This one I think is the more appropriate, which is interrobang. So anyhow, I feel better now. Thank you for that. So when you put those things together, it's like, hello world, right? Like I'm excited, or there's some type of energy behind this, but at the same time, I'm a little confused. I'm questioning stuff right now, right? And so all of that is syntax. Now in code, right? If we want to look at code for a second, let me just do Command KB, and I'm going to go ahead and open up our string file. And we don't need to actually read this, but you can see that we have all of that going on as well, right? So Command KB with regard to $, right? The $sign communicates to you as a developer and me as a developer, as well as the computer. Hey, this is a variable, this is a property. You're going to hold this name in some type of memory so that I can get to it later. Thanks, right? Equals, that's the assignment, something we talked about 1 or 2 videos ago, where we're basically saying, so we're telling the computer and we're telling other developers, hey, there's this thing that I'm probably going to use later, most likely, and what it's going to store is going to be equal to whatever's on the right-hand side of this. Right? And then we get the name of some type of function. In this case, it's a standard library function called explode. And then we have parentheses. And parentheses, again, last couple videos, is a collection of arguments. It encapsulates a collection of arguments. And in this case, it's another variable with a $sign. We know that because of the $sign. And then we get to the next one, which is the $sign plus this. Now that combination is kind of like the exclamation mark compared to the period, right? Because $sign this means specifically an instance of this class, and not just an instance, but this specific instance of this class, right? And then you have the arrow, which basically lets us know that we are trying to get some type of member out, the value of some type of member out of that class or this instance of the class. And then you have another variable name. And we know it's a variable name because it doesn't have parentheses at the end. Because if it had parentheses at the end, then that would be a function call. So all of that is communicated through the syntax. Oh, and I forgot the semicolon. And the semicolon is basically, it's PHP's equivalent of a period. And that's because we use the dot in a lot of other languages to make calls. And I think you can do it in PHP as well. And so, we need some way to tell the computer, hey, this is a complete sentence. We are done speaking right now. Go ahead and execute this code. Right? But that's all syntax. It's all the same thing that we have in natural language. Right? Now, in natural language, we also have semantics. Right? Now, semantics has to do with word order. Okay? It basically word order and what has to exist in order for something to be a complete sentence, right? Or considered to be a complete sentence, right? For example, the spaghetti period, that's not a complete sentence, technically speaking, right? Without any surrounding context or anything like that, the spaghetti is not a complete sentence, right? And so this sentence lacks the requirements to effectively communicate a complete thought, right? And so, if we do that in code, right? Because computers are these very unforgiving things because they don't know anything. They can only do what we give them. And so that's why when we write certain bits of code, if it's not a complete thought or not an executable piece of code, PHP will be like, I got nothing, right? I'm going to error out. So to make this sentence a more complete sentence, I can say this spaghetti was cooked by mom, right? And now it's a complete sentence, right? There's an object, there's a verb, there's a subject, and we're good here. Okay. Now there are certain sentences that are easier to read in theory, right? Or from research, than other sentences. One of the big ones is active versus passive voice. The first example here on line 8, the spaghetti was cooked by mom, is in passive voice. Now we can refactor this, right? AKA edit the document that we're writing, and say mom cooked the spaghetti, right? So what is being communicated has not changed. How it is being communicated, though, has, right? And it becomes easier, like I said, according to research, and I haven't heard of any research that doesn't lean this way. But according to research, this is an easier sentence to read. Mom cooked the spaghetti, right? Because it's subject, verb, object. Done, right? And code is the same way, right? Now you've heard me in a couple of videos in the past talk about the ordering of function declarations and the keywords that go into those. And so if we come up here, because basically what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to read it like a sentence. So I want to be able to say abstract or final, right? So as a developer, I immediately know, do I need to implement this? Can I override it? And if it's not there, then the answer is no and yes, right? No, I don't need to implement it, and yes, I do, or I can override it, right? So abstract or final, followed by static. Is this something that I need to create an instance to be able to access it or not, right? And if not, cool, right? We're good. We'll just leave static out of this whole equation. Then what sort of visibility is there? And you basically have public, private, and protected, right? If it's public, then I can access it directly. I can just spin up an instance or access it through the class, either way. If it's private, then I can't. There's nothing I can do with it. And so it really doesn't matter, right? And then with protected, what basically I can infer from that is that the developer wants me to create a subclass of this thing, and then I can override it or gain access to it in some way. Okay. And then basically after that you have function, which tells the computer this is a function, or the interpreter that this is a function. It is not a property member. It's just a function. And then the name, which we're going to make X right now. And then another optional, which is the return type. So we'll go ahead and just say void, right? So now if I read this with just the options, not the whole thing, but just the options, if I say abstract static public function X, then I know, right? As a developer, I know. It's abstract, I'm going to have to implement it. It's static, so it's on the class, not an instance of the class. So that's going to change that could possibly change what arguments I'm going to ask for. And it's public, so anybody outside of this can access it, which is fine. It's a function, not a property, and this is the name that they're going to use when they call it. Done. Right? Now going back to our example before of there's a certain minimal rule set or certain minimal semantics that you need in order to effectively communicate to PHP, hey, this is what I want to do, and for a function, that is literally the function keyword, the function name, in this case y, and that's it. You don't need any arguments in the parentheses or anything like that. All right. So that's semantics. Now, when it comes to layout, and we're going to kind of have to go pretty fast on this. When it comes to layout, which is what we're going to try to talk about today. No, I'm not trying to save that. This usually has to do with things like margins. So I'm going to bring up a Word document, or not a Word document, a word processing document. And basically layout has to do with, and most word processors will default you into this, basically what size paper is it? In this case, the default is US letter. Great. What orientation is the document, right? Is it landscape or portrait? In this case, it's portrait by default. And that US letter size paper is 8.5 by 11 inches. Where do you want the header and the footer, if they exist, right? How far from the edges do you want it? In this case, the default's to a 1/2 inch for the header and 0.6 inches for the footer. What sort of margins, right? How close to the edges do you want to be able to type? In this case, we have 1-inch margins all the way around. So I can't get, at least not right now, I can't get closer than 1 inch to the edge of the paper. And yeah, so let me go ahead and zoom out on this paper just to kind of show you what that looks like. Right, there's 1 inch here. And if I bring up the rulers by hitting Command R in Pages, you can see that the cursor is at 1 inch. Not only that, but when I hit Tab, what's going to happen is it's going to go about 1/2 inch in. Right, so if I zoom in now, and that's just because by default, margins or tabs are usually 1/2 inch. Okay, and every time I do that, that's what it's going to be. And I don't know Pages well enough to show you where the tabs are. So, and we're also running low on time. But that's what layout is. So when it comes to code, we have the same concept, right? So how many lines are there between the top of the file and the namespace? How many lines are there between declarations, various declarations? Are we using tabs or spaces? That sort of a thing, right? And this is important from the perspective of working and playing well with others and in a community as a whole, right? So first things first, you want to establish a consistent way for you, right? Like what feels right to you and everything like that. Just realize that if you customize the way you speak, right, even in natural language, to the point that other people can't understand you, it's going to be a really frustrating life, right? And so basically, that's where the notion of working and playing well with others comes into effect. So now, if we wanted to make this package available to the open source community and let other people play with it and things like that, then we have to write it in such a way that somebody else could show up on day one and not have to spend an entire week figuring out the entire architecture of our library in order to make this work for themselves, right? For them to be able to start contributing. So one of the ways that we do that is by creating coding standards. Okay, now for PHP, there's something called the PHP Fig, which is the PHP framework interoperability group. And what they do is they try to create standards, or recommendations, I should say. They try to come up with recommendations for the PHP community as a whole to adopt in order to make PHP and the community of developers more mobile. Okay, so if we come back to our string class and our package specifically with this composer.json, you can see down here at the bottom, I say auto load PSR4, and PSR4 is a recommendation. So if we come down here, PSR4, it's an auto loading recommendation, and Composer basically adopts it and complies with it. Okay, so now when it comes to coding style and standards, you basically have 2 official and then one that is currently under review. Okay. So the first one is a basic coding standard. And you can see here they talk about, this section of the standard, so on and so forth. The keywords are this. The top is an overview of what the rules are. Okay. And basically the rules are files must use left angle bracket question mark PHP and left angle bracket question mark equals tags to indicate opening PHP. And the reason that we want to limit people, or the reason that we have to say that, is because PHP has multiple ways that you can open a file or indicate a PHP file. One is left angle bracket question mark PHP. The other one is question mark equal sign. The other one is just straight question mark, right? So left angle bracket question mark, we're done. That can work as well. And to make it to make PHP and various code more compatible, easily compatible on different servers and shared environments, especially, basically saying question mark equal sign or question mark PHP, just stick with those, and those are pretty safe, right? The files must be UTF-8 encoded as opposed to ASCII encoded, right? Just various little things. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself, because what we're really wanting to talk about is going to be margins, and how do we set up that notion of white space. And so there's another project called Editorconfig. Right? This is editorconfig.org. And basically what it does is it allows you to specify at a file or at a folder and file type level what you want to happen. Okay, so to make this happen inside of Sublime Text is I'm going to say Command-Shift-P. I'm going to say install package. I am going to wait for it to call the API. I'm going to type in here editorconfig. It's one of the first ones. Editorconfig snippets gives you some sort of standard ones. But what we're trying to do here, right, because this is about being able to broadcast it out into a bigger environment, is we're trying to say, is basically establish our own. And the way that we establish our own is we're going to right click and we're going to say new file. And it's a hidden file, so it's .editorconfig. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And now we have this blank file at the root of our directory. And basically, Sublime Text, editor config. I'm going to the GitHub project because they have a pretty good example. So let's go ahead and get this as our starting point. So now we have this .editorconfig, and inside of it, first line says root equals true. And what that's doing, because what editorconfig does, is basically at the package level. So anybody who brings in this whole package, if their IDE can understand .editorconfig, this will be applied. Okay, so I don't need to worry about their local settings. I don't have to tell them, install editorconfig and use Sublime Text 3 and get editorconfig snippets. I can just create this file, and as soon as it gets in there, as long as their IDE will understand the .editorconfig file, our work is complete. Okay, so root equals true basically lets you know that you can create .editorconfigs all the way down the folder tree, right? Because the way that editorconfig works, from my understanding, is that when you open up the folder and you start typing, what it's going to do is it's going to look for the nearest editorconfig that has a rule set that applies to that file. And if it can't find a rule set that applies to that specific file, it'll just keep going up until it finds root and basically crash your computer. Not really, but it could happen. And so that's why we start with a rule set, right? And so the rule set is for everything is square angle bracket star square angle bracket, right? And so basically that's saying every file within from this package directory down, if you don't find a rule set that applies, apply this one. Okay? And in this case, we're going to say indent style equals tab, end of line equals line feed. And what that means is basically new line instead of return, right? So \n versus \r. Character set is UTF-8. Trim trailing white space, right? So we don't want any white space at the end of our lines. That is set to true. And then insert final new line, which basically means that there's going to be a line at the end of every file. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add some white space to the end of one of these lines, and I'm going to hit save. And if you notice, nothing happened. So this is sort of one of the oddities of Editorconfig with Sublime Text 3, is that I'm never sure when stuff is going to be established or not. So I close the file, I open the file, and then I hit Command S, and the next thing you know, a line is there that's empty, and all the white space at the end of the other line is gone. So basically it applies it on opening. So if you already have a file open, go ahead and close it and open again if it doesn't seem to be working out. Now, let's open up our string file. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. Oh, and that did not apply. Okay, so I'm going to select all, I'm going to cut, I'm going to paste, I'm going to hit save. And now if I highlight, so if I highlight my tabs now, instead of them being spaces, they are tabs, which means that we know that, well, .editorconfig is definitely rocking it. So, but it's rocking it in the wrong way, because if we go back to PSR 1, I believe, tabs, tab, space, nope, PSR 2. All right, so PSR 2, tab. Yeah, so in PSR 2 it says code must use an indent of 4 spaces and must not use tabs for indenting. I'm pretty sure PSR 1 says this too. I swear it does. But we know we're doing wrong, right? Like either way, by the standard, we're doing wrong. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to, inside of our source directory, is I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, or a new file, sorry. And it's going to be another Editorconfig file. We're going to hit enter, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to grab the rule and the indent style. I don't want to mark it as root because, again, it starts at the file level and it basically just keeps recursively going up the stack until it hits .editorconfig. So we already have a root .editorconfig. So instead of tab, I'm going to say space, and it is very specific in here, or in PSR2, that it is to be 4 spaces. So if I come down inside of Editorconfig, it asks me how big, and I'm going to say indent size equals 4. Right? So, and notice that the root Editorconfig affects even the .editorconfig here. Right? So it's literally every file, right? Because there's a blank line now. So now we have that, and I went ahead and saved the document, and as you can see, we now have spaces again, right? So we now have spaces, and everything's right with the world, except that we need to look at our tests too, right? Because tests are code too. So looking at our tests, right, they're still using full tabs, right? Because so a space is basically one character repeated, or a space is one character and you can repeat it over and over again 4 times. A tab, though, is one character, right? It's just one character. It just takes up more horizontal space, right? Because again, we're talking typesetting here, right? That's what we're discussing right now. And so array test, which is what I just pulled up, is still using tabs. Well, there's a reason for that, and that's that the .editorconfig file is at root, or is inside the source directory. right? We need to put that somewhere else. So let me go ahead and I'm going to say star inside the square brackets. I'm going to say star.php, so it limits Editorconfig to just PHP files. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go over to the root.editorconfig. I'm going to paste that under our sort of global setting. And now if I come into array test, I've got these tabs highlighted. I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and .editorconfig gets applied. And poof, all of a sudden we have spaces. And so then I'm going to delete the .editorconfig file that is in the source folder. And normally I wouldn't create the one in the source folder, because what I typically recommend to folks is create the one that's at root, get your global settings established, establish very general settings for most of your PHP files and most of your Python files and most of your whatever files. Get that established at that root level, and if you need to tweak it at some subfolder level, more atomic level, by all means, go to town. All right, and so now the other part that's nice about this is, like I said, it gets applied every time you save. And so, it's what makes it more like margins and tabs is because I don't have to run a post process, right? Like linters, which is what we're going to talk about next, or in the next video. So with linters, or a lot of linters, what you end up having to do is you write all this code, and I used to see it a lot when I worked on the, or contributed to the US Web Design System project, where basically you'd run these linters, right? Like before you did a PR, and basically you just have this laundry list, and then you'd have to go and you'd have to deal with the laundry list of lint errors, and then finally submit your PR. And so this is really nice from a typesetting perspective, because again, it's margins and tabs and things like that, and you can change it just by going into editor.editorconfig and say, no, I want everything to be spaces, or no, I want the tabs to be this long, or I don't want it to be line feed, I want it to be something else, or I don't want it to be UTF-8, I want it to be something else. So anyhow, hopefully that made sense, and sorry we had to rush it at the end, but thank you for making the time as always, and I will see you around.